I'm particularly excited to welcome Naomi Obert-Baum, who will be first up from the panel because she is a PhD student. We talk about having this discussion and engaging with early career researchers, and often those are the people who are already on that enormously pressurized, hyper-competitive route to tenure, to gaining grants. We actually need to engage the discussion with early career researchers, including the PhD students and below, what's happening and what's causing so many to leave science and science in its broadest sense. Naomi is a student. She's doing her PhD on research on research. She's originally from Canada, where she studied cognitive neurosciences. And she became particularly concerned about publication ethics and integrity. And so she left her original academic discipline to come and study what I think is the new discipline. It's about scholarly communication at one level. She doesn't say that in her. But she started with an internship at Cochrane, did a master's in bioethics, and a lot of house and country moving. And she is now finishing her PhD in Hasselt University, Belgium. And so a big round of applause for Naomi.
Hello. So I'm sorry about the slides. I've ruined a bit of my punchy lines. And I hope it's not going to keep going, but if it does, bear with me. I'll be going back and forth. So I want to thank Catriona for inviting me, and I want to thank OASPA for supporting my travel here. It's really rare that it happens that a PhD is allowed to come to speak in a conference like this, and I think it's great, and it's showing that there's already change happening. So today I want to talk about three things. First, a little bit about myself. Then I will talk about my research and what I learned from my research, and then I'll give some of my personal recommendations for how to change things. So a bit about myself. So I'm a PhD student right now. In the past, I've been studying psychiatry and cognitive neuroscience back when I was in Canada. And already there, I learned a little bit about the dynamics of research and what is going wrong in research. And at the same time, as I was doing my master's in psychiatry, I did a tenure application together with my supervisor. So I helped him to put together the tenure application. We submit the tenure application and we wait for the answer. And the answer from the university is that we need to publish 8 papers in 5 months. And I was a bit shocked. My supervisor was in good shape, and he's like, okay, let's start contacting editors. Let's start splitting publications. You can do 2 papers with that thing, and then you can do this and that. And I asked myself, well, is this really how research should work? And then I did probably the boldest move of my young career, and I quit psychiatry and cognitive neuroscience, and I decided to go fight for good science. So that led me to first be interested in publication ethics, but I realized that publications come really late in the process of research. So I instead became interested in research integrity. And my talk will be about research integrity, which I would say the biggest part of research integrity is openness and science, but it includes other things. And I will try to focus it on open access and open science, but it also includes other things. So right now I'm doing a PhD project, which is called Rethink, Rethinking Success, Integrity, and Culture in Research. And in my PhD, I had 2 different steps. So the first step is a literature review. So I did a literature review of research on research integrity, and I'll talk about that in the end. Second step is I did interviews in focus group, where I asked people, what is success in science? What are the current problems that block science from being very good? And what are the responsibilities to make science better? And in my interviews and focus group, I included the producers of research, so PhD student, postdoc researchers, but I didn't stop there. And this is what makes my project interesting. I included researchers who left science, who left academia, and I included a whole lot of other research actors. And I interview asking the same questions to everyone to see if people have the same opinion. So what did I learn from this? I'll show you 4 of the main findings. There's a lot more, but you can talk to me after. First thing I learned is that there's a clear issue in the way we assess scientists. And we've been discussing this from the beginning, from day 1, panel 1. So there is an issue in the way we assess scientists. And just to show you what I found, so I interview all my research actors, and I ask them about what is an ideal scientist and what is a successful researcher. And what I find is that an ideal scientist is really someone with a heart of gold who's living in a community and helping each other to build knowledge. A successful researcher instead is described as someone who is the winner. He's on top of others. He's excellent, but he's the best. So there's a clear conflict between what a researcher should do and what a researcher needs to do to be successful. So that's the first finding. Second finding is that the new problems that happen in the system, they actually become part of the research culture. And this is very problematic, and this is very important for open science and for acceptance of open access. So when we started science, this is all little me's, so there's like 9 little PhD students there with a heart of gold, wanting to change the world and starting into science. Then they start facing pressure, competition, a lot of expectations from the university. And they know, well, many of them will become stressed, insecure. Not all of them. Some of them really like that pressure, but many of them will feel frustrated about what's happening. And they know that in the end, there's only one of them that will be able to be tenured. So it's less than 10% in Belgium, where I study, that less than 10% of PhD students will have a 10-year career. So many of them leave academia. Lots, most leave academia. And then you have some of the strong fighters that remain, and because there's so few, there's a fierce competition between them, and it's very stressful. It's even more stressful. And in the end, there's the one researcher who gets tenured, who remains in academia. But the problem is that this one researcher is the one who will teach and evaluate the young scientists. And I'm not saying that this researcher doesn't have a heart of gold. I don't want to say that. And I know many tenured researchers are very good people. They have good intentions. But they're also teaching what they're good at. And what they're good at is beating the competition, producing the outputs that the system wants, and having very impressive metrics. And they're good at that. So this is what they will teach. And just to show you an example on open science. So when I did my focus group with PhD students, most of them were really strong about open science. And they told me that they cannot publish their data, they cannot go to conferences because their supervisor is scared of being scooped. It's the same for preprints, as we just learned before, but it comes from the supervisors who are like, don't do that, you won't be successful if you do that. Another example is I had some tenured researchers who told me, well, open access is biased because people get money if they publish your paper, so the peer review is void, and they will publish your paper whatever happens. So they would not evaluate open access papers as well as non-open access papers. So these are the kind of things that come into the cycle of cultures, and then it goes on and on. And I told you I also interviewed people who left academia. And I just want to make a point. Maybe it's not the best audience for this point, but I think it's interesting for everyone to know this. So in my interviews, I had policymakers, I had institution leaders, and many people told me, actually, there's a lot of them, 90% will leave academia, but then they go on to get a good job, and it's not such a big problem. Well, I want to read you one quote from someone who left academia, and you will see that it is quite a big problem. So she was a researcher who was in a tenure track. And she said the following. So she said, "I am the idiot that gave up a tenure track. That's what it is. I worked my entire career to get at that point. I was in it for a few years, and I gave it up. And so many people in the academy want to be in that position, and I gave it up. What kind of an idiot am I? I mean, even my dad said it to me." And then she goes on to say, "In the end, I was like, what's the chance that I'll ever help any patient? Because that's basically why we all start doing it, to make a difference. But that's for the happy few. And those happy few have the big names behind them and get the money. They're not struggling to be at home, to put children to bed or whatever. The daily things that were too hard for me. And now that I don't have to do it anymore, I'm a happier person. So maybe I'm not a real scientist." And it's that point, the last point. Maybe I'm not a real scientist. So her interpretation of the situation is that it's not the system that's wrong, it's her. She was not a real scientist. And this is what I felt in everyone I interviewed who left academia. They feel shame, they feel not good enough for science. And that's something that we really have to consider. Okay. Third point is that nobody feels responsible for solving the problem. So when I started, I'm a researcher, and when I did my interviews, I asked who's responsible for change, and I expected something like this, because this was my vision. So I think institution leaders, policymakers, research funders, and editors and publishers, they have to change things. But actually, I found that by asking researchers, but by asking the other actors, I realized that it's not that simple. And everybody's passing the ball to everybody. So nobody really feels responsible. They all say, yeah, but this other guy also needs to do something. So what happens is that nobody feels capable of doing a change, and nothing is happening. Some things are happening, I'll get back to that, but there's a lot of stagnation. And finally, my last point is that existing approaches, they rarely target the source of the problem. So this is back to my review that I did on research integrity. And I found that we keep describing the problem. There's a lot of papers that say how many people commit misconduct, how many people plagiarize. It's interesting, it's important, but we don't know so much about the causes, and we don't know as much about the approaches. And then I found that papers who describe causes for misconduct or for bad science, they blame the system, just like I just did. But papers on approaches, they target the researchers, and that's weird. So they're missing a little point there. So to summarize my findings, and I'll read this to you, and I think if you want a big summary, this is what it is, but what researchers have to do to be successful, disrupt good science. Researchers who prioritize good science over success do not survive the system. So the problems and disruptive practices become part of the research culture. Most players are aware of the problem, but nobody feels able to change anything. So there's growing distrust, frustration, and loss of hopes. And finally, because everyone feels unable to address the problem, current approaches simply target the researchers, again, and the young researchers, again, and increase the pressure and responsibility on them. So now it's 12 minutes that I'm complaining, probably, maybe a bit more. But my talk is about change, and I wanted to give 3 simple recommendations for change, which is what I think we can do and we should do right now. So the first thing, obvious, is we need more discussion between actors. Isabella just mentioned that too, about the expectations that are not the same, and we've been discussing that, but we need to reach to other actors. You as publishers should reach to researchers, but also to young researchers, like Catriona just did, and everybody has a duty to speak to other research actors. Second point is that we must dare to try to change. So we must dare to disrupt, to make changes. There are some good movements happening, but I think we need more. It's always like that. We always need more, and we need to dare and not to be scared that things will go a bit wrong. But these 2 recommendations, they take a long time. So in the meantime, another recommendation that I think should happen is that we should rethink the way we teach good science. And this is something we already have in place, the structures to teach research integrity. They're in the universities, but they focus on how to discourage bad science. They focus on compliance, so on the researcher has to obey. And what I think is that we should encourage good science instead, so empower the researchers to use the resource available to do more good science. So for example, preprints are not very well known in my field. In my university, nobody knows preprint. Well, let's teach them. And this is something that you can do in conferences, do little workshops on these practices. It's something that universities can do as part of their courses, so really empowering the researchers. So on that note, I think it's important to increase hope, and I think that's part of the change that we can do in teaching. But I bring up Greta here because in a way she's powerful right now in the climate discourse because she's the representative of the children. She's the one who will live on with the mess that we've built. And I think I cannot say I'm the representative of the young researchers, but I think young researchers are not speaking up enough. And if we could speak, I think we would want to advocate that it's time to change for good and to really move things ahead. So on that note, thank you.
So I think we know who should be leading these discussions. Thank you very much. So now on to the pale male section of the panel. And I'm going to skip over it very quickly because you probably know them both. So first, we're delighted to have Britt Holbrook, who's a philosopher from Emory University, and he's going to talk about academic freedom, which is one of the things that Plan S has really raised a debate about. And then Cameron Naylan, who's Professor of Research Communication at Curtin, he's going to talk about what institutions are for NOA. And so I'm very much looking forward to both these talks. Thanks very much.
And, you know, my slides will probably behave, unlike Noemi. I thought she did a great job there handling that. So, good. Okay, so I picked this title because this was actually the proposal of a title for this, the whole panel was universities and their perversities. And then that sort of went away, I think. But I like that because I do think that there's a lot of perversities at the universities, and we should talk about those. And this is going to be a little bit autobiographical, but I hope that you'll see the reason for that as I move on. So I want to talk a little bit about why I think I got invited to do this. And then I want to give you an argument. I'm a philosopher. That's what we do, is we analyze and produce arguments. I want to talk a little bit about open access, but I'll quickly move on to talking about open science because I think there's an interesting relationship between these things. And then I want to talk about academic freedom and responsibility, which I think are really important for us to really address the question of open science. But I want to change it a little bit and talk about academic flourishing, because to me, that is the more important issue than academic freedom. And then at the end, I want to tell you about some deadlines. Okay, so why do I think that I got the invitation? Well, I was on this expert group for the European Commission, and I don't know if you can read it. It's the worst name for an expert group ever. Expert group on indicators for researchers' engagement with open science and its impacts. Say that 3 times quickly. But one of my other members on the expert group was Lynn Camerlin, and when Plan S came out, she got really sort of freaked out by it, and she's like, this is crazy. This is going to interfere with researchers. And Britt, do you want to talk about this with me? And so I co-authored this piece, which had already largely been written by Lynn and her chemist colleagues, but I added a bit on academic freedom. And this then spurred a reaction from Robert John Smits, who was pretty upset. He knew Lynn from working with her in previous groups, and he said, "You come to Brussels right now and talk to me." And she said, "No, I'm not going to do that." Well, it turned out that I was going to be in Brussels shortly after we published the piece, and so I said I'd be happy to go talk to you. So I did, and that was nice. But no, I mean, it was really nice of him to do. I'm not being facetious about that. He was really nice. And Mark Schultz was on the phone during that meeting, and that was also interesting. He got really upset because we had titled our piece calling Plan S unethical, and so I tried to respond to that in various ways. And then Stephen Curry said, "No, it's not unethical." And then I said, "Yeah, we do need to talk about academic responsibility in connection with academic freedom. That's super important." And then people in Nature picked it up and started talking about it. And I like this part at the very end where it says, the quote from Robert Jan Schmidt says, "It's a pity that the academic freedom argument is being used because it stifles a lot of debate." And in fact, it just started this huge conversation, right? So I thought that was pretty funny. So then he's going to Washington to try to get the US to adopt Plan S. And then there's more conversation about this. Again, the pity thing, you know, it's really bad. Don't talk about academic freedom because that's just bad. Okay, moving on. That's why I think I got invited to this, because I engaged in this debate. Okay, so here's my argument. If we want to encourage academic flourishing, then we need to revalue academic freedom. And I think we do want to encourage academic flourishing, so we need to revalue academic freedom. And that's then what I'm going to talk about, how we can do that. Okay, open access. What is open access? Even a stupider question to ask them, what is quality, right? Because everybody knows, right? Open access is the answer to everything. I don't actually think that's correct. I think that open access is merely a means to achieve open science. And I think that we've, in a way, made a mistake because I think that a lot of our efforts have been focused on achieving open access and treating it as the end, when the end is actually academic flourishing, which may or may not be exactly identical with open science. But I think those two are the more important ends to be aiming for. Okay, this was a theme that Sarita also really brought to the fore, I think, because to me, this is the most important aspect of open science. And this is an interesting aspect because it causes some tensions, because the democratization of knowledge is about reducing sort of knowledge inequalities, but that raises some issues for us. I mean, I think that there are tensions within the practice of science, and these have been there for a long time. But I also think that when you get into this notion of democratizing knowledge, you have to talk about balancing these internal tensions also with external demands. And so it's things like, you need to balance the fact that you're an expert with the fact that your work needs to be accessible. It's not just enough for it to be open. I think it's really sort of naive of us to think, well, if it's available open access, then people can use it. Not necessarily the case. And so I think that these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about when we think about how are we going to democratize knowledge. Okay, now this academic freedom issue. I like using Isaiah Berlin because I think his two concepts of liberty is really helpful for understanding some of the issues that people have when talking about academic freedom. For Berlin, negative freedom, it's not a pejorative when he talks about negative freedom. He just means freedom from constraints, really, whereas positive freedom means freedom to. And so it's interesting, Cameron's talk about what are these institutions for anyway, I suspect is very much about positive freedom and what should we be doing, right? What should we be free to do? Okay, so one of the things about negative freedom is that it emphasizes individual liberty and sees limitations on individual liberty as evils, only some of which are necessary. And the idea is to limit the interference with individual freedom, if you like the negative concept. Whereas positive freedom tends to emphasize group liberty, which is a really interesting concept, I think, and one that we need to think about more. And it sees some limitations on individuals as justified in the name of this sort of group self-determination. Okay, so those are the two concepts. Now, here's how you would react to OA if you have a negative idea of freedom. Whether to publish in an OA journal should be up to the individual researcher, right? This is the emphasis on the individual's freedom. And OA mandates of any sort are not necessary, they're just evil. So this is an extreme negative liberty view. Okay, well here's the positive liberty view. What's it for? Well, it maximizes impact and all those other good things that it does, right? And what it does is it allows researchers to maximize their impact and science and society to benefit from research as a whole, right? This isn't about the individual researcher. Put your individual wants and needs aside. This is about science and its benefits to society, science writ large. Okay, so here's some other aspects where I think you'll see the values of positive and negative liberty in these statements about academic responsibility. Because I do agree with Stephen that academic responsibility is part of academic freedom. Okay, so Martin, who I guess many of you know, says, well, what about my freedom to read? Right? You're encroaching on my freedom if you don't publish your stuff in a way that I have access to it. I think this is a really interesting argument. Your freedom to publish behind a paywall inhibits my freedom to conduct research. We need to think about how to balance these things. Mark Schiltz, this is a fascinating part of, this was in the preamble to Plan S, and there's like a whole philosophy of science built into this. And I'm going to read this because it's super important. We recognize that researchers need to be given a maximum of freedom to choose the proper venue for publishing their results, and that in some jurisdictions, this freedom may be covered by a legal or constitutional protection. However, our collective duty of care is for the science system as a whole, and researchers must realize they are doing a gross disservice to the institution of science if they continue to report their outcomes in publications that will be locked behind paywalls. This is a really positive liberty view, okay? So yeah, it may be protected by law that you have academic freedom. However, you have a positive duty to realize the health of the science system as a whole. So there's some balancing that needs to go on here. And I think that this is really important because I think people sort of just have their idea of what academic freedom means, and then they want to impose it on everybody else, instead of us actually having a conversation about what it would mean to balance academic freedom and responsibility, or maybe also negative and positive views of academic freedom. How can we do that? I think that the most important thing that needs to happen is that we do it in a way that does not involve domination of researchers. In fact, what I would like to do is have us do it in a way that empowers researchers. That's a way of maximizing not just academic freedom, but academic flourishing. There's a process of interpretation that's going on here, and we need to not say, oh, you're just trying to slow everything down. We actually need to think about, what do we mean when we're talking about academic freedom, and how can we listen to each other in ways that are productive and help us move forward? Okay, so I want to revalue the notion of academic freedom as a way of encouraging academic flourishing. Now, I wanted to sort of change this because I had written it this way about valuing individuals first, because I wanted to bring in part of the negative view of academic freedom. But really, I want you to interpret this as a way of sort of signaling that what we shouldn't do is totalize or dominate the individual researchers. I don't mean to say that we just need to focus on individuals. We just can't run roughshod over individuals in the name of the system. And so we need to begin with and value individuals. We need to resist dogmatism. We need to be open to having a conversation about these things. We shouldn't just say we've got it all figured out, open is good, do it. We need to embody change. And that means us researchers, us publishers, us science policy makers, we need to do it. We can't just talk about it. There's risk involved, and we should take those risks. And that means one of the things we need to do is challenge the established methods of evaluation. So it's what Noemi said. Okay, we need to seek new standards. The individuals need to seek new standards and exhibit originality. This is sort of going back to these ideas of tensions, right? So you need to, it's about, you have to live up to certain standards, but you also, as you're doing it, need to push the envelope, and that's, I think, part of risk-taking. Individuals are going to change over time. One of the reasons why I started doing this stuff is because the first 11 years of my career, I didn't have a tenure-track position, which meant I didn't have to adhere to disciplinary standards. As a philosopher, if I were getting tenure in a philosophy department when I first got my PhD, I would have been writing papers on Nietzsche for people who do scholarship on Nietzsche. I wouldn't have gotten into any of this open access stuff at all. But I was able then to take risks because I didn't have to answer to these disciplinary standards. I think we need to open up the notion of what it means to be a peer, which doesn't necessarily mean making all peer review processes open in the sense of, showing the sausage. It could involve that. That may be one of the tools we develop in order to do this. But in general, I think we need to sort of get away from the idea that the discipline is the one source of standards. I do think the discipline has to be intimately involved. Okay, and then I want to talk a little bit about policy making, and this involves this way of specifying principles like academic freedom. You can talk about academic freedom, but then you need to sort of specify how this actually works in practice, especially in terms of policy making. Now here's one of the dates. Who knows what this date is? I heard Plan S. Yes, it's the date when Plan S goes into effect, right? So the thing about policymaking is, especially if you've set a deadline, you have limited time to go through these conversations. Got to go fast, right? Speed it up. Here's another date that's coming up really fast, actually. Wait, this is September. Okay, so I still have a little bit of time. This is the date when I need to now submit my completed dossier for tenure. Well, yeah, except here's the problem. I'm here at a non-scholarly, even though it's I consider this totally valuable, it's a non-scholarly conference. Do you think this is going to count for me? Not according to disciplinary standards. I should be writing another publication in a high-impact journal, which is, yes, written into my criteria for promotion and tenure. Thanks.
Okay, so I think based on Catriona's introduction, I'm the old person on the panel. If someone can explain to me when the hell that happened, I'd really like to know, though. I know Heather Joseph is flying back.
I don't mean to interrupt, Cameron, but I think I'm older than you.
You are, but
Yeah,
you're the chair, so that is different. So let me start by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as traditional owners of the land on which my university sits, to acknowledge their elders past, present and future, and their continuing connection with the land. I'd also like to acknowledge the custodial, catering, technical and facilitation staff who've prepared this facility for us today and made this conference happen. And I say those two things for a number of reasons. One, because I think it's a good thing to say. We need to acknowledge history. We need to acknowledge where the resources that allow us to do knowledge making in the Western tradition come from. Certainly a lot of them were expropriated from colonies. And we need to acknowledge labour and work and contribution. And I'll come back to those themes throughout, but I want to sort of start by saying I think generosity and acknowledgement is at the heart of actually how we can make change. So I want to tell a story about myself that also speaks to this tension we've had right from Sarita's talk all the way through, that is really about a fundamental philosophical question about the general versus the local, about the community versus the individual, about shared standards versus local flexibility. All of these things speak to the same fundamental underlying problem. And I'm going to tell a story that I think many of you have heard parts of from me before. So I started off my career in academic science. I have a PhD in chemistry. I was the equivalent of tenured faculty at the University of Southampton, and as an academic, I knew that there were basically two groups who were the source of all the problems in the world. Those were funders and publishers. And then after a while, I moved to a job at the Science and Technology Facilities Council, which is one of the UK's funders. And as I was working there, I realised that there was a fundamental truth about the way the system worked, which was that all the problems in the world were the fault of two groups of people, publishers and academics. And then I went and worked at PLOS, but then I left PLOS, and now I've gone back into the academy, and I've gone back into the academy as a researcher in the humanities. So now I know that all the problems in the world are the fault of the patriarchy, or of the structural systems in which we find ourselves. Now, the thing about all of those things is that all of those perceptions are real, they're drivers of behaviour, and all of those complaints are true. I've sat in the editorial meetings, the technology meetings where you complain about the academics. I've sat in meetings of funders where we've complained at length about publishers. And I've certainly sat amongst academics complaining about all these other groups. And that's what all these things are. They're complaints about what someone else is not doing. And my computer's just decided to reboot itself. So actually the problem is always the technology. So one of the things that we're talking about is culture and values. And at the core of the academy, there is a particular value and cultural behaviour, and it's absorbed by those communities that serve academics. And it's that of being critical. Now that's not a bad thing, right? Our job is not to let people off the hook when they're talking garbage. Can I type my password while? No, I can't. Noemi's giggling at the end because I said I was going to prepare the exact order of what I was going to talk about as I went. Now I've lost the notes, they're going to remind me. The question of those values of criticism has become central. It's become very central in the context of zero-sum games and competition. And that's the thing that's led us into a very toxic space. You heard that testimony of a person who'd left the academy. And because they've left the academy, they felt like a failure. And we wonder why people don't like experts. So we've got ourselves trapped into this critical space, and we do it to each other. We've heard it actually through this meeting, and if I can sort of steal a bit of Toby Green's thunder, he's going to do this in his talk afterwards. We're critical about ourselves. We've heard about how little progress we've made in 15 years. We've made enormous progress. Progress that I think we should be proud of. We've gone from a space where 5% of the world's literature was available to read in some form or other to a situation where that figure now is around about 60%. We've created international networks of repositories. We've created entirely new economic systems that support publishing and dissemination, and entirely new modes of dissemination. And yet we have these sessions about all the things we've done wrong, rather than perhaps learning from the things we've done right. And so I think there's a really critical thing here, and it's really, I'm drawing on Kathleen Fitzpatrick's book, Generous Thinking, which I really recommend as a real salve and call to action for how we can rethink how in the academy we approach, not by not being critical, but being generously critical. And by generous, Kathleen doesn't mean just giving things away. What generous means is actually, in a sense, openness, open to, open for, but not open from. So the story that Kathleen tells is about how we can reimagine our roles and the roles of the university, but I had this title of what is the university for? And I haven't much talked about universities or institutions. And my belief and the work we've been doing at Curtin University since I turned into a humanist researcher has really been about trying to answer that question. And what we believe universities are for, along with the other core institutions of the Western scholarly tradition, is that they create platforms that help us to resolve these general and local questions. They create constraints, they create freedom to, freedom for, by, at some level, enforcing shared sets of values and systems. And what I think is really interesting is that the university has a set of systems and it has scaling problems, so it therefore tends to resort to some form of attempt at an objective measure that is fair and transparent and not biased, not discriminatory. These are all things we're trying to achieve imperfectly. But at the same time, we have these disciplinary cultures that cut across, and that actually the tension between those two things seems to me really important. That actually the answer to the question of the general versus the local is never one or the other. It's about how we construct the systems in which we agree to manage those tensions. The choices about policy making and what policy making is for, the choices about the instruments and systems and infrastructures and what they do to the choices we have is part of a negotiation that we continually construct. And the problem with the critical zero-sum game we've got ourselves into playing is that we haven't left the space for that negotiation. We haven't left the space to have that, and that's just within the groups of white male-presenting professors at recognised universities before we even talk about creating the space for the communities we've traditionally excluded from those discussions. So if the role of the university is to take this role of helping us to negotiate, helping us to change culture over time when we need to and when we have to, because society around us expects us, what do we actually do about that? Because we've heard the problem, the challenges of making that work. It's not my responsibility to solve the entire problem. It's none of our responsibilities to solve the whole problem. But it is, if we choose to be members of a community, a responsibility for each of us to contribute to the solution to the problems. And that's hard, right? So Isabella said that these are not easy problems. These require massive investment and effort and trust, which we perhaps have not yet earned, to be able to take forward. And we need this for society as a whole. We have petulant toddlers in number 10 Downing Street and in the White House, and we've ceded our hopes for our moral centre to a 16-year-old girl bearing the weight of the world on her shoulders. And in the same way, we're doing the same thing with early career researchers, as you've heard. So what do we do to change that when we have limited space to move, limited power to change things? And I think, part of the answer to this is incumbent on people like me, who are now the old grey hairs with professor in our title, to talk about and work and do that change. And, I make some efforts towards that, both at the structural levels and at the small. I think the powerful thing that we can do is actually choose our words carefully. The power of narrative is something we tend not to think about in enough detail. The power of just the words we chose. So, aside from referring to Greta Thunberg as a girl, I didn't actually use a gendered pronoun throughout the entirety of that talk. something I choose to try and do. I talk about qualities in the plural. And I'm trying to move towards talking about these issues of generosity, inclusion, equity, and all those issues that if we try to build a shared language, and again, I think Lauren's poster showing the complexities of trying to be both precise and localised, but also comprehensible, shows the challenges of that. But it's an investment process. We have to invest in that. And sometimes we have to accede to being told what to do. So the form of words I used at the beginning of this was very formalised. It's actually the exact written down text that we use at our university. And there's very similar forms of text are used across universities across Australia and increasingly in other countries around the world with different localizations. And in a sense, it's just a ritual, right? Have I changed the world by saying that? Have I made a significant practical difference? Not really. And many of the people in my institution say that because they're told they have to. But that process of reinforcement, that process of deciding to be part of a change, and sometimes of imposing that, and that's where I think Britt and I would probably put that tension in slightly different places, is critical. So the role of the institution is sometimes to coerce us. The role of funders may be sometimes to coerce us for our own good because society has said that we must change. And so I think here, and I'll finish with this, the question of who gets to say that Catriona posed, I think Sarita gave us an answer to that, is that we have to build the systems ultimately where everyone gets a say. That doesn't mean that we're open to everything all the time, because if we build shared values and shared language in our local communities and in our broader community of scholarship, wherever we define that line, we will have shared values that are not shared by the rest of society. But into that we have to build the porosity and the systems and the institutions that let people in. And I think in the end, to come back to this theme, that we're not really talking about open access anymore. We're talking about open research, open scholarship, open knowledge in the broadest sense. That the systems we need to build, the systems we need to decide to live within, have to make sure that not only do we choose to do this because we have the heart of gold, but because it's something we have to do as part of a community and to be part of the community that we choose to be a part of. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. It's incredibly thought-provoking. I wanted to, just before we open it up for the last 15 minutes, to just see how you, in terms of responding to each other, that there are obviously commonalities between all of what you said. And I mean, what's interesting to me is that you are all researchers. At a pragmatic level, we know that most researchers are not having these sorts of discussions at all, and you're in a minority. And so how do you manage the tension between the aspiration and the reality, and the sort of practical things that different actors, including publishers, can put into place in terms of the sorts of things we're raising in your talks?
So, I think that what you have to do is balance risk with reward. And I don't mean this in a banal way, but I'm not going to get rewarded by my university for coming to this kind of conference, and I still do it, and I want to do it, and I think it's super important. And so you know, I'm trying to push the envelope a bit. You know, it's interesting that I work on issues of assessment and tenure and all these sorts of things as I'm going up for tenure. And I think that a lot of people who are deciding about me sort of think well, you're way too involved to be objective about this. Yeah, maybe so. right? But it's a risk. You have to take a risk, and so I think that's what you do. I think that the way to do it is just jump in and try not to get killed while you jump in and engage in these kinds of discussions.
Does it help? No. Yeah, so when Noemi was talking, I was thinking about how did I create or something, or how did I live with my career, and I was, so the only thing I can do, or I can tell you, maybe all the others, is to just enjoy what you do and be yourself, and do not believe what the others say, because to be honest, so I always thought about, oh, there's this conference, it's at a great place, I will go there. So I've never thought about the system or like the mechanics behind. And in the end it paid off, right? So this is one story I can tell, and it's somehow the living example of how this world could also be, because if you are genuine, and if you are still hardworking, of course, and you're doing a good job, people will notice that no matter what. So there's nothing, you cannot do anything wrong, you cannot make any wrong decisions, I would say. But I know that the environment where I grew up, basically, maybe might have been a good one for that as well.
I will reply to that, because I'm a young researcher, so obviously my stakes are not like the stakes of Britt, who's applying for tenure, and so I'm ready to give up everything if my aspirations are not followed. But I also realized by talking, like I said, by talking to those people who left science, that most of them were the biggest activists. They really had great aspirations for science, and they left because of that, and they felt frustrated because of that. So I'm probably too young to answer how I respond to the practicalities, because I don't right now. And I think you're very lucky to be able to follow your passion, to be able to follow what you want. And I hope it would be the same for everyone. And I think you need people who are strong about their aspirations and who are changing the way they react, for example, to the demands of their institutions. So they dare to challenge them, but at the same time, I think it's not going to work for everyone.
Sorry, I just want to say something about this in particular. So I spent 11 years in a non-tenure track position. Finally got a tenure track position, and now I'm going up for tenure, and then I will be real. If I get tenure, it's really interesting. You can spend all this time doing all this work, and there's a whole body of work out there that's me, but it's like so much of it doesn't count.
Yeah, and I think too many different things to respond to there. I think there's the one answer is the little things. There are little things. None of us feel like we can make the big changes because none of us feel like we have power. And that goes up to levels of ministers and Nobel Prize winners who will say, oh no, I can't do that because the system stops me. And we all have that excuse. So part of the answer is get more comfortable with doing the little things that you can do. I think the other thing that really strikes me, this notion that leaving the academy makes you a failure, not least because I did it, and again through some luck, some skill, and a lot of privilege, got back in. We need to tackle that. We need to address that as part of our. We need to think about one of the things. One thing that drives me mad is that statement that a lot of people make. Oh, no one can read open access stuff in this. And I found the most obscure areas of research always have a community of non-professional researchers that are interested in them. And many of those people are the people we tossed out of the system but want to have some ongoing connection with it. And those people vote, right? Let's go back to the self-interest piece. And I think the other thing is, and I'll point to the work particularly of Baronda Montgomery at Michigan State University, we don't do a good job of mentoring. We need to do a lot better and to reward and support people to do good mentoring as well. I think it's and that's not just for the academy, that's across the publishing industry as well. And in libraries and other places, you know, the number of stories you hear about toxic interactions from various people. So I think I guess I'm rambling now, but mentoring and supporting people to recognize they're doing good work and to support them in doing it, and doing the small things are two things. We should be comfortable with the progress we can make, because we've got an enormous distance by doing those things.
Okay, thank you. Can I open it up? Yep. Stuart, in the front.
Hi, Stuart Taylor from the Royal Society. I'm actually one of those scientists who left science and felt guilt and shame for many years, so I totally understand what you're saying there. Can I just first of all say, I thought your talk, Noemi, was absolutely fantastic. I think about research culture the whole time and quite active involved in it in various ways, but I haven't ever seen it, the problem encapsulated so eloquently as you did it, so thank you very much for that. You said... you said that this audience, can help with this problem, but most of us in this audience are publishers, and publishers are strongly incentivized to drive the system to produce more papers and to play the impact factor game. So do you think it's likely that publishers will be able to help with it?
Well, I think all of you are here because you support good science, you support open science, and I think you want science to be better. And it's a business, of course, and the more papers you publish and the stronger your journal becomes. It's not that straightforward, but I think publishers also have an education power. So there's always, all the conferences I've been to, there's representatives from publishers. There's always people traveling around, and they don't always talk about submitting papers, but there's also a lot of education that you can do with the researchers. You can empower them, give them the tools. In the submission email, let's say, you can ask them, think about doing a preprint or things like that. I don't know, like, I'm convinced, I'm not even doubting that all of you can help, and I'm not even doubting that most of you, all of you, want to do good. So yeah, I'm convinced you have a part of the puzzle.
So, but this is systemic. We can't just reach out to publishers. I mean, but there are publishers here like Punctum Books and Open Library of Humanities who I think are doing it in a different way. But then the researchers resist that, right? Like, I'm not trying to get my book published with Punctum Books, because if I do, my promotion and tenure committee is not going to look at that as favorably as if I, you know. And so we're all complicit in this. It's not just the publishers, it's not just the researchers. This is what Cameron was saying, and the whole notion of the system. But we can't let the system disempower us either.
So it's Robert here from the Wellcome Trust. Can I just follow up on that? Can I just follow up on that?
Can you speak up?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, so Robert Kindly from the Wellcome Trust. So I'm going to do a little plug for the Wellcome here. Nothing to do with the work I'm involved with, but we recognize that research culture is absolutely key, and we have just kicked off a large program to try and understand research culture better and ultimately to change it. And one of the sort of strap lines is not just about the research. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. And we're really trying to support that. So I would just put a plug here for particularly those researchers who are here. We've got a big survey running at the moment where we're trying to understand the challenges you face and what can a funder do. Because funders, we're not the only player. Obviously there's publishers, there's institutions, but we are a player. And if we can get it right, and perhaps we can use our leverage to encourage other funders and so forth. So I encourage you really just to go to the Wellcome website and follow the link and complete a survey. It's a bit long, but it's going to hopefully give us some really useful pointers on how we can start to change this culture.
I'd like to follow up that question. What do you think funders should be doing in this space? Isabella, I'm going to pick on you first.
Not working. What should funders be doing? Well, leave room. Leave room to experiment with publishing options, with topics and everything. So I can understand that the funders sometimes want to push us in some directions, and that is needed, and I can see that, and it's a valuable road to take. But on the other hand, especially also for young research or for anybody, because sometimes also the more senior ones want to, dip their toes into different waters. Why not? So give room and acknowledge that sometimes science does not have an impact, or sometimes it takes a lot of time until it has impact, or define what impact is, right? So this high risk research, which doesn't have a direct impact, or maybe an economic benefit or something, that should be funded as well, I would say.
Can I add to that? I think we've got to be really brutally pragmatic and realistic here as well. It's all well for me to say, wouldn't it be nice if this wasn't a zero-sum game? There are two places where it is unavoidably a zero-sum game. You cannot give the same research funding to more than two things, or $1 is $1 at the end of the day. And the other is, we still haven't figured out how to give jobs to more than one people. So when it comes to appointments, and when it comes to the choices of where grant funding or resourcing in general goes, these are the places where we need to all collectively keep our attention really focused, because these are the places where things can most easily go wrong, and where we can equally do a good job of trying to hold each other to account. It's hard and it's uncomfortable because these are difficult negotiations. But there are real issues about where people do and don't get ahead, do or don't get tenure, do or don't get a job, do or don't get a grant, do or don't get published in the right place for that discipline. And we've got to keep our attention on how we can mitigate those problems, but also just being realistic about the fact that they are problems.
Hello?
Two questions. Another one. I'm sorry, I haven't looked at this side of the room.
Yeah. Thank you. We've listened to what I think is a very extended self-perception on this academic jungle. I've heard it many times, but I think it's scarcely empirically proved the diversity that we can find. And for example, in Argentina, I thought I could see some jungles, but this is something I've never seen. For example, what Naomi said about a person that had to publish 8 papers in 5 months is something really, I can't believe that. So I think you've given us some empirical data on this, and that's why I want to ask you, why did you say that? Did you say that the publishing was late in the career? And what impact do you think that has in this competitiveness that you're trying to show?
Yeah, so you mean why I changed from publication ethics to research integrity, right?
No, my interpretation was you were talking about publication was too late to start thinking about these things in terms of the process of the publication. Rather than,
So what I mean is if you change publication rules, you will initiate change, but it's going to be very slow, because the researchers see the rules. Let's say they need to publish open access after the research is finished and after everything is written up, and then they're like, oh, I need to publish open access. Whereas if you target research integrity, or you target the way they're taught on how to do science, it's much quicker in the research cultures. So that's what I meant. Publication comes at the end of the research. The research is done, it's finished. For example, a practical example is the reporting guidelines, so like Consort or guidelines like this, that you have to say everything you've done in the research you see it basically when you submit your paper. And it should come way before so that you're sure that all these steps are in your research. So that's what I meant.
Hello. So it's Mark Patterson from eLife. So just one little comment about academic freedom. It just struck me that when it comes to the story that we heard today and elsewhere about early career researchers, the notion of academic freedom is a distant dream. You know, so it's sort of the discussion about the effects of Plan S on academic freedom seemed to me to pale somewhat into insignificance compared to the difficulties that early career researchers face. And on that, I just want to build on a point that Noemi made, a sort of a suggestion that you made about increased discussions and bringing early career researchers into those discussions. I would argue that it would be great actually to go to a step further and bring early career researchers into a position of more influence. So not just discussion, but influence. And that's something that we have had some experience of at eLife, and I know other organizations are doing that too, and it's only helped. I think it's helped us, and I'm pretty sure it's also helped the early career researchers involved. So I think, you know, that's what I'd be really interested to hear what people's views are on that, because that's something that publishers can do, that institutions can do, that funders can do, so that that's open to everyone.
Being the chair, I'd like to answer that one first, just by giving a plug to an organisation and movement that is directly speaking to this, which is OpenCon, where there are huge numbers of early career researchers working in extraordinary conditions, doing remarkable things, and I think they are both the leaders and the role models of the future. And it's I'm not the person to speak to this about this, and Heather Joseph at Spark can speak about it more, because that's intimately connected. But if publishers are serious about involving future leaders in how research happens and the process, then that's a community to support.
I just want to say, I think we early career, I'm weirdly early career, so not Noemi and not Cameron. And I sort of had two careers. But what happens to us is that we think of tenure as the end. And that's a mistake. Tenure is a means to guarantee academic freedom. And we don't even think about academic freedom. You're right, we don't. We think about tenure. And until we get that, we're not satisfied, we're not validated, we're not real, and most of us don't get it. And so the whole academic freedom angle just gets pushed way off when we do need to be thinking about what are we doing this for? And I also, I want to bring back that Heather, I love that she brought in education, because we also do things like we separate this whole discussion about research from the discussion about teaching, which is ridiculous. We're doing almost everything wrong. Sorry, Cameron. I know that we're doing some things right, maybe, but we're doing an awful lot wrong.
Do you want to say one?
I was going to say, well, we should still focus on the fact there are some positives. Because if there's nothing here worth doing, then let's all go home and save the tax dollars and do real work.
Catriona, can I just say something? So I'm with OASPA, but I've done a lot of research with early career researchers, and I just wanted to add, this isn't a question, it's just that as well as all of the issues around the academic pressures and the teaching pressures and all the pressures to do with the work, I was really struck with some research I did not long ago with scientists about how their people do. So a lot of it was about having to move far away from family, to move to different cities, commute, not see their kids or their partners or whatever, as well as not having facilities and labs nearby, so spending hours commuting just to do the basic, bare bones of the research. So I just wanted to add on to everything that's been said, that researchers are humans with lives as well, because that can be easily forgotten.
Yes, I think.
And I think that's an important point. It's been made actually more in the library space, but if you start to make sufficient passion for the subject or the topic or the work, that you would agree to do it without being paid. Part of the requirements to be in that role, then we also have, again, it goes back to respecting labour, and I think to Britt's point, you know, the ability of myself to do research is built on the back of adjunct and precarious stuff, so I don't have to do the teaching, and that's, again, a very serious problem.
Well, I think we've run over time. One of the questions I would like to just leave open at the end is that, and it speaks again to what Heather was talking about this morning, is that things are happening very fast, and Britt, to deadlines. Things are changing rapidly. The whole notion of quality is an immensely difficult concept. We actually need to engage researchers and researchers in the humanities with the STEM to actually start to understand some of these things, but we don't have time for the discussion. So how do we marry that tension? Because things are going full steam ahead, and the process and the products and the outputs and the research culture, we may not have time to make those changes. I don't know if you want to say anything to that, but that's what I sort of want to leave. That's a depressing note to leave on, but we do have time.
Yep.
Okay, we do.
Yeah, I mean, so I posted I reposted a fairly epic Twitter rant yesterday or the day before about the progress thing, and when I posted that the first time last week, Peter Suber had, as Peter Suber always does, an incredibly eloquent response that he pulled from a thing that he'd previously written. We need to move fast. We need to move as fast as we possibly can because it's needed. We need to recognise where I will get it all wrong, but someone can find them. But essentially, we need to take the time to realise when we're moving too fast.
Okay, and with that note, thank you very much to everyone who contributed. That's a fantastic panel. Thank you.